The horizon glows red, not from dawn but from burning tanks. Somewhere in northern France, a German officer stares through his field glasses, speechless. What he sees doesn't make sense. The American Shermans, those inferior machines his men mocked, are everywhere. Smoke rolls across the fields as one Panzer after another vanishes under the relentless push of U.S. armor. Radios crackle, orders dissolve, and the proud Panzer divisions that once terrorized Europe are breaking in days. No one in Berlin can believe the reports, but it's happening, right now. The question is how America pulled it off. I'm Wars and Myths, and these are the war stories they never told in school. To understand how America's Shermans crushed the feared German Panzers, you have to step back to the summer of 1944, to the chaos that followed D-Day. The Allies had clawed their way onto the beaches of Normandy, but victory was far from certain. The hedgerows of northern France turned every mile into a fortress. German armor lay hidden behind thick earthen walls, waiting for any Sherman foolish enough to roll forward. It was a brutal stalemate, one the Germans believed they would win. To them, the Panzer was untouchable. The Panther and Tiger tanks were engineering marvels, heavily armored, fearsome at long range, and commanded by veterans who'd fought from Poland to the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht had built its myth around them. By contrast, the M4 Sherman was mocked even by Allied troops. Its armor was thinner, its guns smaller, and its silhouette taller. American tankers knew the odds. In a one-on-one fight, a Sherman rarely walked away. German commanders saw that as proof of their superiority. What they didn't see was the larger game America was quietly mastering. Behind every Sherman rolling into France stood a vast industrial machine, one that no nation in history had ever matched. Detroit had become the arsenal of democracy, churning out tanks, engines, and spare parts at a speed that defied logic. Every damaged Sherman could be replaced in days. Every destroyed unit came back stronger, faster, and in greater numbers. That's where the war began to shift. Not in the design of a tank, but in the system that fed it. American logistics weren't glamorous, but they were lethal. The U.S. Army could move 1,000 tanks, 10,000 men, and their fuel across oceans, rail lines, and makeshift roads faster than the Germans could respond. When the Shermans rolled into Normandy, they brought not just firepower, but momentum. And momentum kills faster than armor. German field reports from June and July 1944 show confusion creeping into the ranks. Commanders complained of broken supply lines, missing fuel convoys, and relentless Allied air attacks that crippled their mobility. The Panzers, designed for lightning offense, now found themselves trapped in defense, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and cut off from the air cover they once relied on. By mid-July, Hitler's generals were arguing in private. Field Marshal von Kluge warned Berlin that without reinforcements and fuel, his divisions were fighting blind. But the Führer refused to hear it. He still believed the Western Front could be held by the myth of German superiority, by the idea that no Allied tank could stand against a Panther. Then came Operation Cobra. Launched on July 25, 1944. It was America's breakout, the hammer blow that would rip open the German line. Thousands of bombers turned a narrow strip of the French countryside into a wasteland of dust and twisted steel. And when the smoke cleared, the Sherman surged through. They didn't pause. They didn't wait for orders. They advanced like a flood. German commanders couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. Tanks appearing faster than they could be destroyed. Armored columns reforming overnight. Radios coordinating movements across entire divisions with machine-like precision. This was no longer the slow, cautious Allied army of 1942. This was a war machine refined through 2 years of hard lessons, powered by industry, and led by men who now understood exactly how to win. The U.S. Army had turned its weakness, the humble Sherman, into an overwhelming force multiplier. And for the first time in the war, it wasn't the Germans dictating the pace. By the time the German high command realized the scale of the threat, it was already too late. The Shermans weren't just winning battles. They were rewriting the rules of warfare itself. In the days following Operation Cobra, the American advance looked less like a battle and more like a storm rolling across France, Entire Panzer regiments were being swallowed whole. German commanders tried to regroup, to establish new defensive lines along the rivers and towns of Normandy, but the Shermans didn't give them time. Each time the Wehrmacht tried to dig in, another column of U.S. armor appeared on their flank, cutting off retreat, slicing through supply routes, forcing them into chaos. At the center of it all was General Omar Bradley's First Army, calm, methodical, and mercilessly efficient. His strategy wasn't to meet the Panzers head-on. It was to stretch them, bleed their fuel, and force them into movement they couldn't sustain. Bradley's men knew. Once the German tanks started running low on gasoline, they were dead machines. That's exactly what happened. The Luftwaffe, shattered by Allied air superiority, couldn't protect the convoys that carried fuel from Germany into France. Every truck was a moving target. Every depot was a bomb magnet. Within days, entire panzer divisions were stranded, their tanks abandoned, their crews retreating on foot. For German officers trained on blitzkrieg, it was psychological whiplash. They had spent years teaching the world that mobility was the key to victory. Now it was America that owned the mobility, not through technology but through sheer organized abundance. Meanwhile, the Shermans themselves were evolving. What began as a modest medium tank was now part of a family of machines. Flamethrower variants, bridge layers, recovery vehicles, and the powerful Sherman Firefly, fitted with the British 17-pounder gun, capable of killing a Panther front-on. The battlefield was no longer a contest of equals. It was an ecosystem of Allied armor, each variant designed for a specific job, and that adaptability terrified the Germans. Colonel Hans von Luck, a respected Panzer commander, would later recall in his memoirs, "They came from everywhere. We destroyed one column, and by morning another was there. It was as if they were being born from the earth." What von Luck described wasn't magic. It was logistics on a scale Germany could never match. While German factories struggled to replace even a handful of lost tanks each month, American plants were producing Shermans by the hundreds. From 1942 to 1945, over 49,000 Shermans rolled off U.S. assembly lines. For comparison, Germany built fewer than 6,000 Tigers and Panthers combined. The numbers alone told the story. But the reality on the ground was even more brutal. When a Sherman went up in flames, its crew could be back in another tank within days. When a Panther broke down, and they often did, it was left behind, too complex to fix under fire. By August, Allied reconnaissance reported something unthinkable: entire panzer divisions vanishing from the map. Not destroyed in combat, simply dissolved by exhaustion, by lack of coordination, by the impossible pace of the American advance. The German High Command's disbelief bordered on denial. They blamed the weather, the terrain, the Luftwaffe, even each other. Anything but the fact that their once feared armored corps was being outclassed by an army that had learned how to fight smarter. Behind closed doors, however, the truth was impossible to ignore. In a desperate meeting at headquarters, one German general reportedly slammed his hand on the table and said, "We no longer fight men. We fight machines that build themselves." By mid-August, the Falaise pocket began to close, trapping tens of thousands of German soldiers. It was the beginning of the end for German armor in the West. What had once been Hitler's pride, the unstoppable panzer divisions, were now encircled, shattered, and humiliated. And it was the humble Sherman that had done it. But here's the thing. The real brilliance wasn't just in the machines. It was in the minds that used them. Because while the Germans obsessed over perfection, the Americans mastered adaptation. And that, more than any tank or gun, would decide the future of the war. Let's strip the myth down to its bones. The German Panzers, Tigers, Panthers, and King Tigers en war were technological marvels. No one denies that. Their long-barreled 80mm guns could pierce a Sherman from over a mile away. Their armor was thick enough to shrug off almost anything the Allies threw at them. They were on paper the kings of the battlefield. But war isn't fought on paper, and while the Germans built perfect tanks, America built a perfect system. The men inside those Shermans are young, often barely out of high school. They weren't elite. They weren't aristocratic like many German officers. They were mechanics, truck drivers, farm boys from Kansas and Pennsylvania who'd been trained to do one thing: work as a crew. Inside a Sherman, that teamwork mattered more than any gun. 5 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, operated like muscle memory. The gunner didn't wait for orders to adjust. The loader didn't need to be told twice. Every second counted, and those seconds saved lives. German crews were highly skilled too, but they often treated their tanks like art pieces, handcrafted, temperamental, and irreplaceable. American crews treated theirs like tools. You used them hard, fixed them fast, and got back in the fight. That difference in mindset between precision and practicality became a weapon in itself. German armor doctrine was built for attack. The famous Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Fast, decisive, overwhelming. But by 1944 they were no longer the lightning. They were the storm being chased. The Sherman, with its faster traverse speed and more reliable engine, could move across terrain where Panthers bogged down. In the tight hedgerows of Normandy, the German long-range advantage disappeared. Engagements happened at 200 yards, not 1,000. The first to shoot, none, or the first to move, usually one, and that's where the Sherman's agility paid off. Its gun turret rotated twice as fast as a Panther's. Its tracks handled mud better. Its maintenance was simpler, and unlike the Panzers, Shermans could operate for days without breaking down. German units often had to abandon perfectly good tanks because they simply ran out of spare parts. The Sherman's gun was smaller, but it had something the Germans lacked: versatility. The M4 could fire high explosive shells that devastated anti-tank positions, bunkers, and infantry alike. In combined arms warfare, the kind America perfected, that versatility mattered far more than armor thickness. Add to that the Firefly, the British upgraded Sherman with the deadly 17-pounder cannon, and suddenly the battlefield calculus shifted. Shermans weren't alone anymore. They hunted in packs, regular M4s flanking while the Firefly delivered the kill shot. German tankers learned to target the Firefly first, often mistaking it by its longer barrel. But Allied crews adapted again, painting the end of the barrel to mimic the shorter standard gun. It bought them seconds and sometimes enough to fire first. Even technology became a matter of cunning, not just engineering. American commanders like Patton and Bradley weren't trying to outgun the Germans, they were trying to outthink them. Patton's Third Army was a study in organized chaos. Tanks racing ahead, fuel convoys roaring behind, air cover coordinated to the minute. His motto was simple: attack and keep attacking. It was speed that the Germans couldn't match. While Hitler demanded that his generals hold ground at all costs, Patton's men were already 100 miles ahead. He didn't care about the line, he cared about movement, and movement is what wins wars. By August 1944, the U.S. Army was fighting a new kind of warfare, one that blurred the line between offense and logistics. The Shermans didn't need to win duels, they just needed to keep moving, keep breaking through, keep forcing the enemy to react. That philosophy, relentless forward pressure, broke the myth of the Panzer, because a Tiger tank can't fight if it's out of fuel. A Panther can't retreat if its tracks snap, and a German army can't win if it's forever on the back foot. From German after-action reports, a tone of disbelief seeps through the language. They describe American forces as mechanized floods, unending columns, armies with endless depth. One SS officer at Mortain noted that, for every tank destroyed, another took its place within the hour. The numbers were one thing, but the psychology was worse. The Wehrmacht had spent 5 years believing they were the masters of modern warfare. Yet here they were, outmaneuvered and outproduced by a nation they had dismissed as industrial amateurs. That humiliation went deeper than defeat. It shook the very identity of the German military, because it wasn't just that the Americans had more, it was that they made more mean something. Every Sherman on the battlefield represented a web of rail lines, factories, workers, and supply ships stretching across the Atlantic. Destroying one changed nothing. The system kept feeding itself. For the Germans, that was demoralizing beyond measure. But there's still one angle missing, the moral one. Because behind this industrial triumph was a question that haunted even the victors. At what cost does efficiency replace humanity? That moral question hung in the air long after the guns stopped. America's strength, its unmatched industrial capacity, came from the same system that turned war into an assembly line. Efficiency, precision, production, the same logic that built refrigerators now built death machines. Inside the Sherman factories, women riveters and machinists worked 12-hour shifts. The air smelled of oil and steel. Every tank that rolled out carried a serial number, and a silent reminder of the men who'd soon climb inside. To them, it wasn't about glory. It was about survival. They knew the Sherman had weaknesses. They knew it could burn if hit. Some even nicknamed it the Ronson, after the lighter. Lights every time. But still they climbed in. Not because they believed the tank was invincible, but because they believed in what it represented: momentum, unity, and the idea that they were part of something far bigger than themselves. And that's the thing, a war, at its core, isn't just machines against machines. It's systems against wills. The German system was built on fear, hierarchy, and faith in the individual genius of its weapons. The American system was built on trust. Trust that the supply chain would work, that the crews would adapt, that reinforcements would come. One was rigid. The other was alive. Take a moment to imagine what that looked like on the battlefield. A lone Sherman, outgunned and cornered, calling for artillery support. Within minutes, a formation of P-47 Thunderbolts swoops overhead, striking the ridge ahead. Smoke covers the field. The Sherman crew reloads, flanks, and fires. Not because their tank is superior, but because the entire American war machine is behind them. That's coordination. That's power. For the Germans, that interlocking machine was impossible to match. By 1944, their economy was crumbling. Oil fields in Romania were bombed to rubble. Rail networks were shattered. Factories couldn't keep pace. Hitler's obsession with wonder weapon, like the King Tiger or the V-2 rocket, drained resources from the front lines. Meanwhile, the United States was building both quantity and quality. By late 1944, the Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was an adaptable platform. Field modifications added extra armor, better guns, and new radios. Some Shermans were fitted with dozer blades to clear obstacles. Others carried flamethrowers for clearing bunkers. Every problem became an engineering challenge, and every solution was standardized, mass-produced, and shipped by the thousands. That kind of adaptability terrified the German command. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, saw it clearly. In a grim report to Berlin, he warned that American adaptability in the field posed a greater danger than any single weapon. He wasn't exaggerating, because while the German tanks grew heavier, slower, and more fragile, America's tanks grew smarter. The U.S. Army was learning how to wage sustained mechanized war, the kind that doesn't depend on any one miracle weapon. And that evolution came directly from hard lessons, from North Africa, where early Shermans were torn apart by Panzer IVs. From Sicily, where mud and mountains tested their engines. From Italy, where tankers realized that communication was deadlier than armor. Every loss taught something new. Every mistake was filed, fixed, and folded into the next advance. Germany couldn't do that. Its command culture punished failure. America refined it. By the time U.S. forces pushed through France, those lessons were encoded into doctrine. A living, breathing system that turned chaos into strategy. Even the Germans knew it. Captured officers often admitted that it wasn't the Sherman they feared. It was the speed with which it returned. Destroy one, and by nightfall there'd be 3 more. That's not a weapon. That's inevitability. And yet, beneath all that power, the moral tension never disappeared. Tank crews watched their friends burn inside those steel coffins. They saw villages flattened, forests turned to ash. They won, yes, but they paid for it in youth, in innocence, and sleepless nights that followed them long after the war ended. That's the paradox of the Sherman story. It was a symbol of both life and death. progress and destruction, because what it proved, brutally, unmistakably, was that in modern war victory doesn't always belong to the best weapon. It belongs to the side that learns faster, adapts harder, and refuses to stop moving forward. And that realization and that speed, flexibility, and mass could beat even the most advanced enemy became the foundation of every American war doctrine that followed. By late summer of 1944, that doctrine would face its greatest test yet. The Shermans were closing the Falaise Gap. Tens of thousands of German troops were trapped. And what happened next would leave even hardened Wehrmacht commanders stunned. Because the final blow wasn't just a victory, it was a revelation. August 1944, northern France. The German 7th Army was collapsing. All across the countryside, dust clouds rose from retreating columns. Tanks, trucks, horses, men, all funneled into one shrinking corridor between the towns of Falaise, Troun, and Chambois. The Allies called it the Falaise Pocket. To the Germans, it became a nightmare they couldn't wake from. The U.S. 3rd Armored and 90th Infantry Divisions were closing in from the west. The Canadians and Poles pushed from the north. And on the southern edge, General Patton's 3rd Army came roaring up like a thunderstorm. Sherman's leading, tracks grinding over the wreckage of the German retreat. Inside the pocket, chaos reigned. The once proud Panzer divisions, Lehr, 2nd SS, and 12th SS, were in tatters, radios jammed with desperate chatter, bridges collapsed under the weight of fleeing convoys. What had once been a disciplined fighting force was now a traffic jam of terror. And the Shermans kept coming. Columns of olive-drab tanks poured through the gaps like water through cracks in concrete. They weren't fighting duels anymore, and they were hunting. Tank destroyers, artillery, infantry, and fighter bombers all worked in concert, striking in waves. It wasn't about glory or one-on-one kills. It was about annihilation. German officers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Wherever they turned, American armor appeared. On maps recovered later, Wehrmacht staff scribbled frantic notes. Enemy armor, everywhere. Panzer Commander Fritz Langanke later described the horror in his diary. Every direction we turned, another Sherman appeared. We had no ammunition, no fuel. They came like a tide that could not be stopped. That tide wasn't just the Shermans, and it was the full force of Allied coordination. For the first time in the war, air and ground were working as one. P-47 Thunderbolt circled above, dive-bombing convoys, cutting off any escape route. The smell of oil, burning rubber, and cordite filled the valley. And in that valley, the myth of the German Panzer died. For days, American and Canadian armor hammered the retreating Germans without pause. Some tried to fight back. Tigers set ambushes along narrow roads, taking out Shermans from hidden positions. But for every tank destroyed, more rolled forward. The U.S. repair crews worked within earshot of the front lines, dragging damaged Shermans back, patching them up overnight, and sending them back into battle. Even the Germans noticed it. Captured officers later told interrogators they couldn't comprehend how fast American tanks reappeared. "We thought they were endless," one said. That illusion, endlessness, broke the German spirit. By August 19th, the trap had closed. The Allied noose around the Falaise Pocket drew tight. Inside, 50,000 German troops were surrounded. Panzers sat immobilized, their crews abandoning them and fleeing into the forests. Some tanks were destroyed by their own men, a final act of defiance to deny them to the enemy. When American troops entered the pocket, what they found defied belief. Fields littered with wrecked tanks, Tigers and Panthers burned down to black skeletons. Horses and trucks tangled together in ditches. The stench of fuel, smoke, and death hung in the air for miles. Eisenhower himself called it one of the greatest slaughters of any war. The Germans had been crushed not by superior weapons, but by overwhelming synchronization, the very thing they once claimed to have perfected. And as Allied photographers moved through the wreckage, one image told the story better than any report. A Sherman tank, muddy and dented, rolling past a burned-out Tiger, the symbol of the old order giving way to the new. Yet even in victory there was a sense of disbelief. Many American tankers who had faced the Panthers head-on couldn't quite grasp what had happened. They'd spent months hearing that their tanks were inferior, that a Sherman couldn't stand up to a Tiger, and yet here they were, driving through the remains of Hitler's best. The truth was brutal and simple. The Germans had built weapons for prestige. America had built weapons for war. The U.S. Army didn't need a perfect tank. It needed one that could win tomorrow. By the time the last shots echoed through the Falaise Valley, the German armor in France was finished. Less than a third of their original tank force escaped. Entire Panzer units ceased to exist. For German commanders, the shock was personal. They had believed in the invincibility of their machines. They had watched them dominate Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Now, they watched them burn, undone not by some secret superweapon, but by the relentless pressure of an army that refused to stop advancing. In the aftermath, German General Eberbach, captured near Chartres, was shown rows of captured panzers. When asked what went wrong, he simply said, "We lost the war of movement." He was right, because in the fields of Normandy, America didn't just beat the panzers, it rewrote how modern war was fought. When the smoke cleared over the Falaise pocket, the war in France was effectively over. What the German High Command had considered a tactical withdrawal had turned into an industrial-scale disaster. The once proud panzer divisions, the heart of Germany's armored might, were now twisted ruins scattered across the French countryside. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. From the start of the war, German doctrine revolved around the idea of the decisive strike. Concentrated armor, precision, and tempo. But in Normandy, America flipped that doctrine inside out. Instead of concentrating force in one place, they spread it everywhere. Instead of precision, they used persistence. By late August 1944, the Germans weren't retreating, they were running. What the German generals didn't fully grasp until it was too late was that the American army had mastered the art of continuous warfare. No pauses, no time to regroup, no operational reset. Shermans would advance, infantry would follow, engineers would repair roads overnight, and fuel convoys would arrive before dawn. It was a rhythm of war the Germans couldn't match, a tempo that turned every battle into a chase. That was the real shock. Not just that the Americans won, but that they never stopped moving. In the days after Falaise, as the Allies surged east toward the Seine, the once fearsome Panzerwaffe was barely functional. Fuel shortages crippled their mobility. Spare parts were non-existent. Even the vaunted Tigers, which once symbolized unstoppable power, became roadside monuments. Tanks too heavy to move, abandoned by their own crews, often destroyed by their own engineers to prevent capture. The psychological impact was devastating. A captured German officer told his interrogators, "It was like fighting the sea. You destroy one wave and another takes its place." That line, "fighting the sea," perfectly captured what made the American war machine so terrifying. It wasn't just numbers. It was inevitability. Where the German system prized brilliance, the American system prized endurance. And endurance in total war always wins. The commanders on both sides knew it. Patton himself, riding at the head of his armored columns, marveled at the pace of his own army. "My men can outfight and outmarch any army in the world," he wrote in his diary. He wasn't boasting, he was observing. The Third Army was advancing faster than the Germans could retreat. German radio intercepts confirmed it. Entire divisions reported being overrun by tanks that appeared faster than we could deploy. One desperate message from the 2nd Panzer Division simply read, "We cannot hold. They are everywhere." By early September, Paris was liberated. The panzers, once the hammer of Europe, had been reduced to fragments scattered across two fronts. In the east, they were being crushed by the Soviets. In the west, by the Americans, and still Berlin refused to accept it. Hitler demanded new counteroffensives, new miracle weapons, new tanks, heavier, thicker, more complex. But every improvement made things worse. Each new model required more fuel, more parts, more training, luxuries Germany no longer had. Meanwhile, the United States streamlined everything. If a Sherman broke down, it was replaced. If a bridge collapsed, engineers built another. If a unit ran out of ammunition, trucks arrived within hours. The machinery of war ran on a kind of ruthless logic, impersonal, efficient, and unstoppable. That's why, when German officers finally inspected captured American tanks, they were stunned not by their design but by their simplicity. The Sherman wasn't elegant. It was practical. And in war, practicality wins. Even Guderian, one of the few remaining strategic minds still speaking reason in Hitler's bunker, admitted that Germany had lost not to superior tactics, but to superior organization. The Americans wage war like a factory, he said bitterly. They build faster than we can destroy. That realization spread like a quiet epidemic among the surviving Panzer crews. What began as disbelief turned into resignation. By the time the Ardennes offensive rolled around that winter, Hitler's last desperate gamble, most veteran tankers already knew the truth. The tide had turned for good. The Panzers had become relics, powerful, yes, but doomed by a system that could no longer sustain them. And the Sherman? It became more than a tank. It became a symbol of American adaptability, of mass production turned into battlefield dominance, of a democracy that had outbuilt a dictatorship. From the beaches of Normandy to the fields of Falaise, it proved a simple truth. In modern war, perfection is the enemy of victory. The Germans had perfected their machines. America perfected the war. And in those fields littered with burning armor, German commanders finally saw it, the moment their old world collapsed beneath the weight of American steel. When the guns finally went silent in Europe, the wreckage stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the outskirts of Berlin. It was a graveyard of ambition, broken tanks, scorched fields, and the remnants of an army that had once believed itself unstoppable. For the Germans, the sight was unbearable. Entire panzer divisions that had thundered across Poland and France just 5 years earlier were gone. Their commanders, once symbols of blitzkrieg brilliance, were now captives, men stripped of pride staring blankly at the American convoys rolling past. And those convoys never seemed to end. Columns of Shermans, half-tracks, jeeps, and trucks, mile after mile of American hardware, rumbling east, feeding the final push into Germany. To many German officers, it looked less like an army and more like an industrial organism, steel, fuel, and flesh moving in perfect synchronization. One officer reportedly muttered, "We lost the war the moment we fought a nation that builds like this." He wasn't wrong. The United States had mastered something Germany never could, the logistics of victory. The arsenal of democracy had transformed a once isolated nation into a machine that could sustain global war without breaking stride. Even as the front moved hundreds of miles, American factories back home didn't slow down. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the U.S. had produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks, more than 300,000 aircraft, and enough trucks to move an army from one ocean to another. The Germans could barely keep their tanks fueled for a single offensive. That was the defining difference, not just in hardware, but in philosophy. Germany built for shock and awe. America built for endurance, and endurance again is what wins wars. But here's the thing, for all their power, the Americans never lost their human edge. The GIs who manned those Shermans weren't engineers or aristocrats. They were farm boys, mechanics, teachers, ordinary men who learned to fight in steel machines and adapt faster than the enemy could predict. They didn't worship the tank. They worked it. They improved it, modified it, and made it fit the battlefield in ways that would have horrified a German engineer. But that's why it worked. Every dent, every welded plate, every makeshift repair told the story of a nation that refused to let the ideal get in the way of the achievable. That attitude, pragmatic, restless, unpretentious, was the essence of the American way of war. It's why when the Shermans rolled through shattered German towns in 1945, people weren't just seeing machines. They were seeing a civilization's will made visible in steel. Somewhere outside Kassel, an American tanker wrote in his journal, "We started this war chasing the Germans. Now they're running from us. I don't know when that changed, only that it did." That's the quiet line between dominance and disbelief, when even your enemies can't understand how you're still advancing. And it wasn't just the Germans watching. The Soviets saw it too. The British saw it. The whole world saw what happens when America turns its factories, its people, and its sheer determination into a single, unstoppable force. It's easy to talk about tactics and technology, but in the end, what won the war wasn't a tank or a gun. It was belief. Belief that no matter how bad it got, America would find a way to outbuild, outfight, and outlast anyone who stood in its path. That's why, even decades later, when veterans from both sides met at reunions, one line kept coming up in conversation, whispered, sometimes grudgingly but always with respect. The Shermans never stopped coming. If you want to see how those same factories that built the Shermans turned America into the world's unmatched superpower after the war, make sure you're subscribed. The next episode tells that story. When the last American Sherman rolled to a stop in the heart of Germany, the war in Europe was over, but the echoes of its thunder didn't fade. They became the sound of a new world being built. The Germans had entered the war believing that precision and perfection could overcome mass and will. The Americans proved them wrong. War, they showed, isn't about flawless design. It's about momentum. The kind that doesn't stop, doesn't pause, doesn't wait for permission. That's what the Sherman embodied. Imperfect, undergunned, often underestimated, but always moving. Always pressing forward. Even when they burned, new ones replaced them. Even when they broke, the men inside climbed into another and kept going. That rhythm, that relentlessness crushed not just German divisions. It crushed the very idea that Germany could keep up. To the German generals who survived, the shock wasn't just losing. It was realizing how fast the tide had turned, that the same American army they once dismissed as untrained and soft had learned, adapted and outproduced them into oblivion. And when they saw the endless lines of tanks parked across Europe, they finally understood. This was what industrial democracy looked like when it went to war. The world saw it too. The Soviets, watching from the east, took notes. The British, exhausted but grateful, called it a miracle of logistics. But to the Americans who lived it, it wasn't magic, it was grit. Men welding through the night in Detroit. Women tightening bolts in Pittsburgh. Convoys rolling through mud and snow from Normandy to the Rhine. A whole nation that refused to stop, because they knew what was at stake if they did. By the time the surrender came, even the enemy had to admit it. America hadn't just beaten Germany. It had buried the myth of German invincibility under mountains of steel and determination. And for the soldiers who made it through, the memory stayed sharp. The smell of oil, the sound of the tracks, the sight of another Sherman cresting the hill, engine roaring, gun steady, proof that they weren't alone. That image, the unstoppable advance, became part of American memory. The tank wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a statement that no matter how fierce the enemy, how long the odds, how brutal the cost, America keeps coming. They say history is written by the victors, maybe. But this history, this victory, was built. One rivet, one engine, one tank at a time. And it left the world staring at the same question those German commanders asked in 1944. How did they do it? The answer, of course, is simple, and that's what makes it so powerful. They believed they could, and then they did. When the smoke finally cleared and Europe fell quiet, the Shermans stood scattered across fields they'd never meant to see. Some were burned-out hulks. Others sat half-buried in the mud, their crews long gone home. But even in silence they told a story, not of steel, but of people. Every dent, every scratch, every name etched into armor was a reminder that wars aren't won by machines. They're won by the hands that build them, the hearts that drive them, and the will that refuses to stop when everything else does. That's the real legacy of the Shermans. Not just the victories or the statistics, but the spirit behind them. A spirit that said, we'll outwork them, we'll outlast them, we'll make enough to keep going, no matter what it takes. And when you look back now, at the black and white footage, the faces streaked with oil and exhaustion, You can almost hear the echo of those engines, still rumbling through history, because what America proved in those few, furious days wasn't just that it could win a war. It proved that no force on earth can stop a free people once they decide to move forward. And that, in the end, is why those German commanders were stunned, not by what they saw, but by what they never imagined was possible. You've been watching Wars and Myths, where every battle has a story, and every story has a truth. Stay with us. The next one will change how you see the war all over again.